fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life.
It seems like there's a lot going on with this apartment complex down the way. We've had some folks calling in about it repeatedly, and just curious if y'all have any experience with that.
You know, being in the neighborhood as long as you have, you've seen kids and families who their address changes 3 times in 6 months. You know, I've never met the owners of that apartment. I've met the managers before. I've been in that space with my coaches and kids. And so it is a hard environment to live in.
But you may take roads where you never see it. I think the story of a lot of Memphis is you may live out east and then you drive in to downtown or wherever you're working at and you have no idea. You never see stuff like this that's going on and how it affects families.
And unfortunately, our city is so massive in square miles. And so people need to come into the environment, see the conditions, it burdens their heart, and then the people who have true political influence can influence the right people, the right organizations, and then problems will begin to be solved.
Yeah, this guy, like I said, he's helping the neighborhoods out, you know, a lot of the blight, and strumming through these photographs, you can see that's a mold issue there. But we're gonna have to address that. Hope no one's living in there, but in some cases they do. So we're gonna see what's going on. I mean, this represents the city of Memphis. This is near the airport. You know, this is an area where people travel back and forth, going back and forth to the airport and to the bus terminal, which is down the street. You pass through this all the time. But I mean, you don't walk past a pink elephant and don't think it's there. You know, and that's what you're doing here. You know, you walking past this like, it's not mine, I'm not concerned. It's not livable. These conditions are bad here. How you doing, ma'am? I'm Inspector Griffin, and I just want to see some of your concerns of what you have and show me what's going on here. It's fine? Okay.
That's mold too, as well as you see it painted over at the top.
When you all talk to management about this issue, what have they said?
They said they was gonna come and get some mean green to spray and said that was it. That was how they was gonna get it off. But mold, you can't get, you can't use that.
We have this property in court, okay, already. And I think the occupancy rate here out of the units we have is probably, what, 10 families around? 10 or 12 families?
Yeah, 10 or 12.
And that's very low,
right, considering
how large this complex is.
Exactly. The whole back is not even, it's still vacant. Yeah. It still have furniture in the apartments. I mean, it's a mess.
You've got some issues here, without a doubt. And some of the issues are very inhumane.
Yes, it is.
I'm going to come back, I'm going to talk to the area inspector, and I'm going to talk to his supervisor and let them talk to the manager, and we're going to try to do a sweep out here, because from what I see here, the other units are pretty much the same.
Exactly. And my kids, they constantly having coughs. I'm coughing. It's just too much.
We in mold.
Yeah, we just want to play.
It's mold. And they're not helping in this condition. They asking for rent money, but they're not fixing our situation. We don't know who we paying our rent to. We just giving out money. And then they writing it on notebook paper. So who's to say what they doing with our money? They not fixing anything. Of course you can see that. They not doing anything that they supposed to be doing. They just getting money and telling us to pay rent. We don't want to live in this kind of condition. To keep on paying $500 or $700.
Yeah, different tenants over here, they paying different amounts of rent.
I can promise you something's going to be done.
Okay. Thank you so much.
All right.
Y'all don't know how much we have to cry.
Yeah, right.
I'm glad to see that we never close this out when it comes to the NFHA court. And It's open up for a reason. I'm glad it is, because now we've got more concerns. And now this is time to do something about it. We need to know who these out-of-town owners are. The majority of a lot of these vacant properties you see in Memphis are owned by out-of-town owners. That's why it's hard to find them. And we have to have investigators to go around and try to locate these people. It costs taxpayers money to do this.
So as Katie has said, my name is Tanya Coleman. I was silent for a while, but let me do my introduction and then we will get to the panel. My name is Tanya Coleman and I'm a compliance monitor for the I'm a compliance administrator for the City of Memphis. Thank you all for joining us for this session. Our first presenter, well, I won't say our first presenter, I will introduce first Seamus Roller. I think I'm gonna have to take my glasses off because from my setup. Seamus Roller. Seamus is the Executive Director of the National Housing Law Project, which is a legal and advocacy center working to strengthen and enforce the rights of tenants, increase housing opportunities for underserved communities, and preserve and expand affordable housing. Before joining the National Housing Law Project, Seamus served as the Executive Director of Housing California. Mr. Rolla is currently board president of Brilliant Corners. Next, we have Morgan Williams. Morgan is the general counsel of the National Fair Housing Alliance, which pursues pioneering legislation under the Federal Fair Housing Act. Before joining the National Fair Housing Alliance, Mr. Williams served as the general counsel of the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center. Morgan and his team at the National Fair Housing Alliance has conducted a study on tenants' rights in Memphis, and he'll be presenting some of those points today during this session. Last but definitely not least is our moderator, who you've heard from for a few seconds. Our moderator is Professor Katie Ramsey Mason. Professor Mason joined the faculty of the University of Memphis Law School in 2018. As an assistant professor of law. Professor Mason also serves as the director of the Medical Legal Partnership Clinic, a collaboration between the law school, LeBarner's Children's Hospital, and Memphis Area Legal Services. The clinic provides legal services and social work services to low-income patients and families of LeBarner facing legal issues that may affect their health and well-being. Katie is also a member of the Tennessee Bar Association. Now I'll hand you all over to Professor Mason. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Glad we were able to hear from you. So we have a great lineup of speakers, as Tanya just introduced. And what we're going to do is we're going to let Seamus and Morgan make presentations on some of the issues that they have been working on related to Memphis and beyond. And then we're going to have about 20 minutes of discussion, and then we'll do our best to leave a few minutes at the end for Q&A. And I think that the easiest thing will probably be for people that have questions to put their questions into the chat. And I will do my best to keep track of the questions that appear. So with no further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to Seamus. Thank you.
So I thought Morgan was going first because he's doing the presentation. Is that right, Morgan?
My apologies.
That sounds great. And I do have just a logistical question. I have the PowerPoint open and I've also circulated it, but I'm not sure. Should I go to a share screen format with this?
Yes, I think that would probably be the best.
And forgive my limited technical capabilities here, but if I was to try to do that.
I think it's the box below the where our faces are that has the computer screen with the line through it. If you click on that, that should allow you to share your screen.
Great. Are you all able to see it there? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great, Katie. Can you see the presentation there?
Yes, we can see the presentation and hear you.
Okay, great. Well, then I'll go ahead and jump in here. Thanks so much, everyone, for the discussion here today. I had the opportunity to be a part of one of these panel discussions in the pre-pandemic times with one of these Memphis housing summits a couple of years ago, with Roshan Austin talking about redlining issues, persistent redlining issues. Shortly after that, we did enter into a partnership agreement with an institution there, Patriot Bank, in part to provide some assistance to some organizations that were providing services like The Works in South Memphis. And even, as of last week, the Department of Justice announced resolution of yet another redlining case in the city of Memphis. And so it's really good to be back with you here, although I do miss being in the same place with everyone. And certainly the video opening kind of brought home I think the realities of the work that goes on, and that I think also being in the same place can also manifest that. So it's glad to have that video, but miss being in the same place with you all, partners in this work. So I want to talk briefly about some recent work that we've been doing at the request of the City of Memphis, and specifically a analysis of housing rights that we are preparing to issue in the coming weeks or so with our City of Memphis partners, but wanted to walk through a little bit on the background of what has gone into that analysis, some of the key findings, and some recommendations. So that'll be a little bit of the overview of what we'll what we'll walk through here. Again, I'm Morgan Williams. I'm general counsel with the National Fair Housing Alliance, and we are a fair housing office. It's based in DC that works with a lot of local fair housing centers. In some jurisdictions, there are not full service fair housing centers, and so we've been more engaged in some of those jurisdictions, including in Memphis, although there is a great local partner in the legal services office there, which I'll talk more about. So in terms of background on the analysis of housing rights that we performed just recently in these pandemic times, we were engaged by the City of Memphis about a year ago. And to put this into context, this is after the summer of 2020, in which the Black Lives Matter movement really took people's attention, not only nationwide, but on the local level, community by community. And that has certainly been the case in Memphis. And I think we can hope may bear out sort of more attention on some of these issues around segregation and wealth inequity along racial lines that as a country we're more attuned to, and even at the local level we may advance policies to address more aggressively moving forward. And it was in that context that we had sort of conferred with some local partners about some issues in the Binghamton neighborhood around displacement. And the City of Memphis was really interested in thinking long-term about kinds of solutions that it could engage in. And so in the course of the past year, we've carried out this analysis that has involved community surveys on housing issues and rights, interviews with local community housing and legal experts, and a law and policy review of laws in Memphis around housing issues, and recent kind of policy documents and reports. And we wanted to note our partners in this effort. The City of Memphis has commissioned this report, which we'll be, issuing in the coming, weeks. Building Memphis is our main local partner, carried out the survey efforts, and really was a lead thought partner in carrying out the whole project. Innovate Memphis, which is also a very significant thought partner in the project, as well as a few local housing attorneys who were noted here on the slide, really helpful in thinking through the project at different stages. We also want to note that in the course of conducting the research for this report, we want to note our appreciation for the interview participants, the local experts and practitioners, and the survey respondents, the Memphis residents. And so it's with that I'll provide some context into the methodology and implementation. And it specifically took place in two parts. One was engaged interviews with key stakeholders, and our Building Memphis partners were very helpful, in particular in carrying out this first focus area around community level practitioners, addressing how the city is addressing residents' needs, fair housing, and tenant protections. And then NAFA, with the assistance of some local partners in kind of crafting some of the questions, carried out, these other two focus areas of local interviews, of local housing practitioners and local legal practitioners, looking at issues of segregation, displacement, gentrification, fair housing protection and enforcement, the impacts of COVID, and the city's housing policy. And we carried out these surveys with Building Memphis. And transition here to talk a little bit about the findings. In the surveys, in particular findings, there were 730 completed surveys. Some of the questions involved some fair housing issues, and 82% of the respondents are aware of housing discrimination in Memphis. Only 50% of respondents know how to pursue their fair housing rights. And that discrepancy, unfortunately, is not unique in different communities, but is accounting for a gap that we need to fill. Respondents say that credit score history is a major barrier to housing, and respondents say that they've used payday lenders or know someone who has payday lenders to pay rent, utilities, mortgage, or housing repairs. 40%. And so, those are noteworthy parts of these Memphis resident respondents' experiences that depict sort of issues with access to credit and issues with accessing mainstream credit that may build wealth over time. And so, in terms of our key findings around our key practitioner interviews, I think that there was a noted need to invest in direct outreach to, especially in this COVID time, with rental assistance funds and different kinds of programs available to educate residents on their rights, the eviction process, and landlord-tenant rights, as well as to educate landlords on the full scope of the program and engage them in those programs. To empower residents to have a successful home buyer qualification and lending process. And there are key partners in the local community development network that are sort of key agents in working with residents to do so. And then continued support for the Memphis Housing Trust Fund, the repair rehab programs for low income or fixed income homeowners. And that, I think, is noting that, that a part of the issue with the big geographic scale of Memphis and the blight that still, plagues some neighborhoods, that the focus on change there can be, more oriented to repair and rehab than than demolition, and that there are actual systemic racial equity considerations at play in that prioritization. And in addition to the local policy practitioner interview responses, we spoke with some local legal experts. I think determination there is that, oh no, I'm getting a indication that my laptop battery my computer needs to be plugged in. So I'm going to probably have to pause here momentarily to do that. I'm so sorry. But I'll complete this slide and then pause momentarily. I'm so sorry. That the local fair housing protections are limited under the Tennessee Constitution and Tennessee preemption statutes, and some of that is really locked into, the structure of Tennessee and how local jurisdictions can establish civil penalties and damages. Local ordinance that assign damages precluded, but also there are statutes that limit local protections around sources of income and how sex is defined in regards to gender or sexual orientation that may actually contravene the federal fair housing protections and call into question things like the state fair housing agency's designation of substantial equivalency. But local legal experts also commented on how the COVID crisis has complicated the existing affordable housing crisis, and noted how the city remains deeply segregated, driving discrimination in all aspects of housing choice. And so I'm going to pause here momentarily, if you'll excuse me, to just briefly plug in my computer. I'm so sorry.
Okay, and while we're waiting for Morgan to get his computer plugged in, just for those of you who have joined us since the beginning, we are going to be trying to leave a few minutes at the end of our discussion for questions. And I just ask that you put any questions in the chat. I'm going to try to keep track of them there. So we will wait just a minute. There's Morgan back with us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Katie. And I'm assuming that you're still able to see the presentation here. So I'll carry on. Great. Well, this sort of brings us to sort of recommendations. This is sort of like the highlights of some of the recommendations. And it is fairly city oriented, although there are partners that are involved in all aspects of this. And, some of this is lifting up recommendations that have been made in other recent reports, and including in terms of fair housing, issues that have been identified sort of persistently in what the city does in regards to their fair housing planning. And so I want to take one step back momentarily in my remarks here to just note the existence of the mandate under the Federal Fair Housing Act that all local jurisdictions that accept HUD funds have to use those HUD funds in a way that affirmatively furthers fair housing. You're supposed to carry out these plans, these analysis of impediments to fair housing, and then those are supposed to inform the use of their HUD funds. And it should be noted that the city rightfully did a recent analysis of impediments that was issued in 2019. And it recounted some important recommendations that we uplift. And it also recounts, recommendations from the last time that the city went through this assessment of impediments to fair housing almost a decade ago. And so I think a part of this is recognizing, and I think this is a part of what the Black Lives Matter movement asserts, is that the segregation, the abuse in some ways, in some instances, and the wealth inequity isn't anything new. It has been persistent since the days of explicit segregation, since the days of slavery. And I think that, what the Black Lives Matter movement said is it's not new, and it's on us to make the changes that need to be made. And so a part of what we're saying in this report is, let's take stock of what has been uplifted in prior reports and prior proposals, and let's turn them into action. And so I think there's a few things that are noted here. One is there is the need for greater local fair housing enforcement. And, I think what we're proposing is that with local fair housing partners at the local legal services office, that there is a launch of an independent full service fair housing center in the region that can secure HUD FIP enforcement funds, that can pursue systemic enforcement and legislative advocacy and testing-based investigations in a robust way, because there's the broad need for that. And there's an opportunity to secure those, to develop that institution, secure those resources, and create an engine for ongoing enforcement on those issues that, yes, the DOJ can come in and pursue some enforcement. And yes, the National Fair Housing Alliance and the National Housing Law Project and other national offices can provide local support to local partners that exist there. But without a full service fair housing center office, there's not going to be the drive of the fair housing enforcement capacity that's needed to really address the long-term segregation and wealth inequity in the city. Two additional recommendations that I'll highlight here, and these are going to be spelled out more in the report, and happy to talk more about this in the question and answer, but that the city should really review its zoning code to ensure that it allows for housing integration. And a part of this means looking to ensure that certain residential densities are permitted across various residential uses. And then also considering amending its code to include affirmatively furthering fair housing requirements. And there's recent work that's been going on in Boston that I think may provide a good model for the city of Memphis. And then also in regards to the city's operations, and I think this is something that Seamus may talk more about, or that Katie also has some experience with, is that there needs to be a further reorientation of code enforcement capabilities to ensure that habitability standard compliance is pursued in occupied rental units, because the affordable housing crisis is also a crisis of residents living in substandard housing, and part of that is tied to issues of prevalence of out-of-state renters that I think we'll talk more about as well. But that's a further kind of city-focused recommendation that we'll, I think, talk more about. And then just there is a range of programs that need to be instituted to promote home ownership and support tenants' rights. And we can go through that litany. And I know Seamus has some depth of experience on some components of that. But the city needs to be taking a strong leadership role in both these arenas. And there's a lot of fodder for really good work that can be done in that space. And so I'll stop there, and Katie, turn it back over to you, and happy to kind of delve into any aspects of this further. But we'll cede my sharing of the screen as well.
Thank you, Morgan. That is really, really interesting data that you have generated, and we're all looking forward to seeing the final version of the report. I know that Seamus from the National Housing Law Project has some things to add as well, and so I'll turn it over to Seamus, and then we'll get into a little bit of a discussion.
Great, thanks, Katie. I thought about starting this differently today, but I think many of you may have noticed that the Build Back Better plan, the infrastructure proposal from President Biden, looks like they have a deal around this. And so I was thinking about some of the things that Morgan was talking about and some of the challenges that I've heard from friends of mine in Memphis about housing conditions. And I think, we need all of the enforcement. We need to address the existing conditions, but there's oftentimes this opportunity to think about reimagining housing conditions when there's money, right? When you have this opportunity. There's going to be $150 billion for housing within the Build Back Better plan. There's the Emergency Rental Assistance Program funding. That there's a chunk of money already for Memphis. there's going to be additional money for housing in the next appropriations that's going to come out for the coming year at the national level. So there are all these tools and all this money that's going to pour into housing programs within Memphis. And one way that you deal with that is just to continue to do what you've been doing with those funds all along, or you have this opportunity, I think, to say, all right, we have what may be probably hundreds of millions of dollars coming in to address housing needs. Can we do that in a way that changes the patterns that we've used in the past? Is there a way in which we can use those dollars to address segregation, to address habitability concerns, to think about how we take the federal money that we have and shift the housing market in a way that better serves the people of Memphis? And I think that's that moment that we find ourselves in, which we haven't had this level of investment in housing since the 1970s. And so what do? Do we repeat the patterns of the past, or do we imagine a better future for the people in our cities and think about how we do that in practice? So I'm going to talk mostly about evictions and emergency rental assistance and tenants' rights issues. That's a lot of what I do, or at least have done during COVID. And my organization is a national support center for legal services organizations across the country that work on housing. And so that's a lot of where my experience comes from, is talking to legal aid attorneys on the ground and organizers on the ground, and then do federal advocacy around that. And, sort of during the COVID period, there's a couple of stories that stick out in my mind that remind me of the challenges we have across the country. And one is a story I worked on with a reporter of a woman who owned a mobile home in Montana, and she got behind on her rent because she lost her construction job because of COVID. And she had owned this mobile home, I think, for 16 years, and her rent was pretty low, about $600 to rent the site. And she got behind by about $1,200 on it, and ended up getting evicted from her property, losing the one major asset that she had that helped take care of her and her 3 kids. And to avoid it, to avoid the debt, she ended up selling her mobile home to the mobile home park for the back rent that she owed. A couple of months later, she was employed again. She was able to rent a house for her and her kids, but she was paying twice what she had paid before to live in the new house that she was in, right? More stress on them economically. And so the thing about this story, I think, is that because of this momentary crisis in her life, right, this small period of time in which she was unemployed that was driven by a public health crisis, she lost the biggest asset that she had, one which created stability for her and her 3 children, and destabilize their family in a way that's going to have ripple effects down the road. And so I think that we need to find ways to sort of intervene in that process in a way in which we can stabilize families, because that's what's good for them. It's what's good for the community as a whole. And if we do it right, it can also be good for landlords and not affect their bottom line. And I think during COVID, one of the big lessons for me was that for many tenants and landlords, the relationship between them is a personal one. That they have a personal relationship, and that's driven, a lot of the dynamics. Some of the outlying cases is an extremely impersonal relationship. But for many people, tenants have gone out of their way to pay their rent, to do everything that they can to get their rent money to their landlords. And I think if you look at rent payments to landlords during COVID, they've remained pretty similar to the way they were before COVID hit. And also that many landlords have gone far out of their way to make sure that their tenants have remained housed, whether that's waiting for rental assistance, repayment plans, forgiving rent. And that when tenants and landlords have a personal relationship, the dynamics have been much better in most cases. So I think for me, reforming the eviction system is about, one, curbing the abuses from the small percentage of really terrible landlords that are out there, right? It's like, how do we prevent those landlords from being abusive? How do we prevent them from taking advantage of tenants? And 2 is, how do we think about reducing the number of non-payment evictions? Because in practice, non-payment evictions are often for a small amount of money, in average less than a 1 month's rent. And they're often the result of temporary unemployment, a health crisis, or some other short-term financial crisis in a family that family is going to get over and be able to move on. And that intervening in that is really inexpensive in comparison to the destabilization that results for many families as a result of evictions. And so I think thinking about this, like eviction is a summary proceeding, and it is the fastest civil procedure that there is in almost every jurisdiction across the country. It lacks all of the sort of rudimentary aspects of due process that you might imagine a court has. Many people are evicted without notice. They're evicted in default proceedings, which can last only seconds long. In many cases, a tenant doesn't have an access to hear the argument against them. They have very limited ability to present evidence in their case. And in a practical sense, in most jurisdictions across the country, you can get sexually harassed by your landlord. They can evict you for no reason at all, and they can steal your security deposit. And there's almost nothing you can do about that, right? And that just shouldn't be the dynamic that tenants find themselves in across the country. There should be ways in which we can intervene, make that a more just interaction and one that is more stable for tenants overall. I think the other thing about that too is that, this ends up being seen as a zero-sum game between tenants and landlords. And I want to say to those landlords who are out there that the worst landlords put you at a competitive disadvantage, that their predatory practices, the ways in which they try and strip wealth out of the poorest people in the communities, put you at a competitive disadvantage, that they're trying to find ways to use fines and fees and other things to make more money out of the poorest people, and that the dynamic for good landlords is hurt by that entire process, and that there are ways in which we can curb that. And I know that there are challenges within Tennessee because of what's happened in Nashville, but that there are tools that Memphis has to sort of deal with that, and that the eviction process itself is one of racial disparities as well. Part of that is that African Americans are more likely to be renters, but also because of this. Because of segregation, because of the ways in which eviction records are viewed by landlords, because many of the owners are themselves white, and so there's a racial dynamic on the landlord side in the way that those interactions happen. And so there are reasons too, if you're interested in segregation, if you're interested in equality, that we need to address the eviction system. So I think the reason to intervene here is that evictions are a crux, right? They are this moment of crisis in somebody's life, and some people are going to bounce right back. But for many families, eviction is like shaking a snow globe. It upsets every part of their life, and some things are going to land back fine, but many things are not. That the most predictive demographic factor about whether you're at risk of eviction is whether you have small children in the household. If you have small kids there, that often means that they have to change schools. It means that their daily routines are upset. That eviction is a predictor of future mental health issues. It's a predictor of future suicide. It's a predictor of worse school outcomes, physical health scores. That it just has all of these bad outcomes that are both bad for families, but also expensive for the social services system. And there's few other things I can think of where we might be able to intervene and spend $1,000, keep somebody in their house, and save huge amounts of money down the line. So I think thinking about what to do about this, right? One is to think about the Build Back Better money that's coming down. How do we think about those dollars and how to spend them? There's $9.8 million in Memphis in the Emergency Rental Assistance 2, the longer term money. Like, do you want to do? You have a lot of flexibility around what you can do with those dollars. Making sure that the emergency rental assistance program works, thinking about right to counsel, thinking about eviction diversion programs at the court level. Can you slow down that process in a way in which you can give tenants a little bit longer to get assistance, to pay their landlord back, to find a new place to live in a way that's not entirely disruptive to their lives? And so I think you need to think outside of who the normal partners are. Think about the court systems. Think about how to tie these systems together in a way in which keeps families stable. Obviously, some of this is about the state, right? Landlord-tenant law is primarily done by the state. So thinking about, how long do you have to cure an eviction, which means like if you do get the money together, can you pay your landlord back and stay where you are? And so, how much notice do you have about an eviction? So thinking about this, there are things, and this has been led by very different people around the country, depending on the city. Housing organizers have been crucial in many places, but sometimes it's been led by city council members and mayors. In other cases, it's been led by lawyers. The leadership around these issues can come from many different places and has, depending upon the city you're talking about, across the country. And so, I think the challenges that Memphis faces are not necessarily unique. They have many common elements to other places. And so thinking about the strategies that those places have used and those cities have used to address their issues overall, and to be able to think about eviction in that moment has so many things tied into it, and how it is a process in which we can intervene. And given the emergency rental assistance funding, we'll have at least many of the tools over the next 4 or 5 years to continue to do that and think about how we can increase housing stability overall.
Thank you, Seamus. Really interesting food for thought from both Morgan and Seamus. And I want to start our discussion portion of this session by going back to the video that we watched at the very beginning of the presentation, which dealt with our local code enforcement office. And I'm wondering if either of you or both of you could comment on what you think the role of code enforcement is or should be in terms of promoting fair housing and tenants' rights.
Well, I can just speak briefly on sort of some of the context as we heard it in our review. And, I think, Seamus, you might have some thoughts about sort of on the solution side. In short, well, or Seamus, do you want to kick it off? Sorry, I don't know. No. I think that a part of what we heard was that there was there's a very strong focus on blight, and that's a big focus of the 3.0 plan, and of the city's broad priorities over time. And a part of that means looking at issues of dilapidated housing as a means of pursuing avenues for demolition and ultimate displacement of the tenants of that housing, oftentimes in predominantly African-American neighborhoods. And instead of looking at rehab initiatives that would allow for homeowners in those neighborhoods to rehab their homes, or for targeted purchase programs that would allow for residents to purchase homes in those neighborhoods. But on the code enforcement side, there's also the need for greater enforcement of not just the code when it comes to housing that is blighted for demolition purposes, but that is inhabited for habitability purposes, because there's a great deal of the Memphis housing stock, existing rental housing stock, that is in a dilapidated condition, which is a broad issue across a range of societal concerns, but especially for children living in that housing, where there may be in particular issues with lead or other factors that may have real long-term implications for their health. And so to the extent that there has been deployment of code enforcement policies in those arenas, I think the sense is that it hasn't manifest actual enforcement. It may manifest even an issuance of a citation if there's sort of persistent complaint, but then that is not backed with real enforcement. And that enforcement requires resources and deployment of prioritizing that issue. And so I would say that the city, we've heard, could deploy that issue more heavily, and that actually is what the sort of bit of the focus of that third recommendation on that highlight page. But Seamus, turn it over to you.
Just building on what Morgan said, quite a bit around this out-of-state ownership of properties and corporate ownership and that issue. I think one is that lots of corporations hide behind a lot of LLCs and other ownership structures. It's difficult to figure out who they are. rental registries requiring every landlord who's renting a property just to register and to have a license. And those license fees can be very limited. I mean, sometimes they're $6 or something like that for a year. It forces the landlords to disclose who the actual owner of the property is. And I think, I was talking about that personal relationship, that many of the ways in which renters, their experience and landlords' experience is moderated by that personal relationship. And that is going away as it's, real estate investment trusts and corporations that are owning properties. And that without regulation, their incentive is to squeeze every dollar that they can out of that system and out of the pockets of poor people in general. And so thinking about how to moderate that as a whole. The other thing I think about too, and Morgan touched on this in his presentation, is you need a public interest legal infrastructure to help people enforce their rights. And Memphis needs a stronger legal infrastructure overall in order to address some of these concerns. Because in practice, what we've done across the country is to outsource a lot of the protections of the rights of the lowest income people out to legal aid, to fair housing centers, and to other organizations. And so those need to be funded well. I know the City of Memphis did in the past had provided a lot more funding in this area. But this needs to happen as well. And there, I think, are opportunities at the national level for increased funding for legal services and for fair housing. And so those are important also.
Thank you both. I want to, follow up on a couple of things that you've mentioned thus far, especially, Seamus, you mentioned the prevalence of out-of-state ownership in the rental market here in Memphis, which is a very significant factor in the dynamic. And, are there ways in which that fair housing protections and better tenants' rights could actually be attractive to property owners, especially people who may not have the presence in the community? I mean, is there a way to sort of sell this as, as something that is actually beneficial, not just to tenants, but also to landlords?
The economic argument that I would make is if you're going to bid up against a 20-unit property and you live in Memphis, and what you're doing is you're bidding up against a corporation. And that corporation's business model is, we're going to charge fees for every late payment. We're going to abuse the court systems in order to get our rent paid by filing serial evictions over and over again against tenants. We're never going to forgive any rent. We're going to, harass people as much as we can. That's how we're going to operate our business. You're going to have a hard time bidding against that property because they're going to be able to pay more because they've got a business model that is predatory, that's designed to extract money. That's the dynamic, that you need regulation against those outside corporations in order for the housing market to function and for you to be competitive as a small landlord moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think Katie, part of what embeds your question is just sort of the scale of the extent to which the rental market has been just so consumed by out of Memphis owners, and I think that's pretty well reported on very recently in the Innovate Memphis City the State of Memphis 2020 report. And they found that, and I could just do the shared screen again here and just kind of pop that up. But let's see. They found here, this is from, a report that was done with a number of partners just recently, led by Innovate Memphis and the City of Memphis and others. But it charts here, among other things, this figure shows the number of non-owner loan totals. It increased by 300%, over 300% in a 7-year period here. And I think that the noteworthy part of this span from 2010 to 2017 tells you a lot about what is at play in the sort of broader dynamics of the Memphis housing market. And it really is this sort of post foreclosure crisis factor of large national companies that have investment backing buying big portfolios, and that has really deeply impacted the state of the Memphis housing market over this 7-year time frame. And it's going to have profound implications for the city in regards to the landlord-tenant issues that Seamus noted. It's going to have other significant issues in regards to issues with neighborhood stabilization over the long term as they relate to the importance of home ownership as it plays a role in local wealth generation and in creating stable neighborhoods. And so a part of this is a lot that needs to be done on the rental side, but also a lot that needs to be done on the home ownership side, especially to Black homeowners, to first-time homeowners, to homeowners in Black neighborhoods, and across the board in a way that accounts for the racial wealth gap as it's sort of embedded in our housing market. So I would just add to the question with that response.
Thank you. One of the other things that has come up in in this conversation, and also that many of us in Memphis are acutely aware of, is the tension between the state and local governments when it comes to efforts to enforce things, code violations, rental registries, tenants' rights protections, et cetera. And I'm wondering if you can comment on the difficulty of that relationship that we experience here in Memphis, and maybe with both of your knowledge and understanding of what's going on a national scale, if there are other places that are experiencing similar challenges where the state is oftentimes preempting legislation that could be beneficial to our renter population in Memphis, and whether you have any suggestions for how we in Memphis can work around that, or can possibly even work with property owners to try to address some of these concerns.
Yeah, there's so from a legal standpoint, there's sort of two different kinds of states. One's a home rule state in which the local jurisdictions can pass whatever they want, absent state intervention, and others the local cities can only do what the state allows them to do. So there's different sort of structures around the country and how this works. But this is a problem across the country around state preemption, is what it's called from a legal standpoint, where in Texas, Austin passed a source of income to protect voucher holders, to make sure voucher holders could rent. The state stepped in and overrode that law. This is happening in other places across the country. I think one of the challenges that I see is that you have, at the national level, an apartment association and an association of realtors that has bought into this idea of making the market have as little regulation as possible to allow the flow of big money to do whatever it wants at the local level. And I think that's a real challenge. And so for those owners that are a part of realtor associations or apartment associations, I think they have become a real challenge to thinking about how to protect communities and how to build the sorts of cities and places that make the most sense and that are good places to live and which protect the people within them. And so I think there's a little bit of a toxic culture going on there that needs to be challenged. And then I think, you also just, as a place like Memphis, you need to figure out what tools you have and try to work with those as much as you possibly can. And there are just some things that, they're just never going to preempt, right? And thinking about how you use the control that you do have, how you invest the dollars that you have. I think so often cities are segmented in their infrastructure in a way that they don't think about, all right, this is how we want to grow. This is how we want our cities to function. And you got one department, you got to have leadership to get those departments to talk to one another, to think about that city and the tools that you can use together.
Yeah, and I would add to Seamus's remarks in response to the question about the state issue to just note two things. One is just sympathetic commiseration. I actually work remotely from New Orleans, and and I think we share sort of similar dynamics in some respects around broader state politics. And as Seamus said, there are a number of states where local measures have been passed, such as local source of income protections in Memphis, and the state has then come around and implemented specific statutes to prevent states or municipalities from expanding the protections beyond the federal protections. And it's a tough dynamic. I think maintaining the sort of efforts to reform that should be a priority. Notably, I think the landscape has shifted in regards to the recent Supreme Court decision in Bostock, where in the Title VII employment context, the definition of sex has been deemed to specifically include sexual orientation and gender identity. And the other component of the state preemption statute specifically defines state sex to mean the sex that you were, assigned at birth. And so, there's an argument to be made that the Federal Fair Housing Act and the state preemption law are at odds, and the state should not be granted substantial equivalency, which is a designation that it needs to be able to get the fair housing funds that the state office currently receives. So, it's definitely a broader issue for consideration around that preemption statute I think for all parties involved to think about and advocate around long-term over possible changes. But within the second thing I would just note is I think it speaks to the need for enforcement of the federal rights that are there. And I think that three broad areas that are ripe for local fair housing enforcement are around credit access. And you saw that last week with the recent DOJ announcement around another redlining lawsuit in Memphis. But there's a lot around credit access issues that I think would address some of the long-term homeownership issues in Memphis. And I think we will see more enforcement in that space moving forward. And a second issue is around accessibility for people with disabilities. That's an issue that I think has been neglected, and that we've heard from local advocates that it's been neglected and maybe ripe for enforcement. And then a third issue is just plain old simple racial discrimination in the rental market. And testing evidence is a really valuable tool to ferret out that discrimination. And all three of those forms of fair housing enforcement under the Fair Housing Act are ripe for enforcement today, regardless of state preemption and state limitations.
Well, thank you both so much. And we are at 11:45, so I do believe we need to wrap up. And thank you also to Tanya. And Tanya, I don't know if you have any closing remarks, but we really appreciate, Seamus and Morgan, your time and your interest in our city and our county. And we look forward to working with you in the future again.
Thank you very much. And it's look forward to continue to be a part of these conversations with our Memphis partners and to further this work with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.